Hey guys, in this video I'm going to run through our best race setup for every track in F1 2021 so far. This doesn't include the 3 tracks which Codemasters are going to release later this year, but as soon as they're released I'll drop them into another video just like this. This video is going to be a long one, so I'll leave timestamps in the description below so you can jump to the track you're interested in. All of these setups have been designed for long distance races of 50% plus, but can be used in shorter races such as 25% distance. And every single one of these setups is created for dry weather. If these setups help you out, drop this video a like, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to be alerted when I drop other F1 2021 content, including the setups for the new tracks which will come later this year. But for now, let's jump right in and look at the setups. Looking at the aero setup, you should definitely opt for a higher rear downforce at Bahrain. You need to have a good rear end to help the car stick through the fast and twisty middle sector, so go for a rear wing aero of 9. Then on the front of your car, you can either go for 5 or 6 front downforce. Opt for 6 at the front if you want a little bit more front end grip, or you can opt for 5 at the front if you want to reduce your drag and increase your top speed, which is ever so important at Bahrain. Moving on to the transmission, lower your on-throttle diff ever so slightly to 68. This will help a little with traction, especially out of the slower turns 1 and 10. Then, lower your off-throttle diff to 58, which will help you rotate the car into the slower corners. The suspension geometry follows a similar path to F1 2020, with higher amounts of front camber and lower rear camber and toe, although don't push these values to the extreme, otherwise your tyre life will suffer. The suspension, however, is one of the areas where you'll see a reasonable change from last year's game. You will want to run a soft suspension with softer anti-roll bars this year and an increased ride height. This year's game will punish more extreme setups, so you can no longer run your car extremely low to the ground or with a 50-50 brake bias. For this setup, I found that the best suspension setup is 3 and 5 on both the suspension and on the anti-roll bars, and 3 and 6 on the ride height. This will give you a soft enough car to attack the curves, which is key to a fast lap time, but you'll also have enough rear rigidity to keep your car planted and stable through the faster turns. Next up, we've got our brake setup. And as mentioned earlier, you need to run a much more realistic brake bias this year. If you run your brake bias close to 50-50, you'll find the rear of the car will overtake you when you brake heavily. So go with 95 on the pressure, which will help you avoid locking up into turn 10, and 56 on the brake bias. Tyres again are another part of the car setup which has changed this year. Low rear tyre pressures are a thing of the past, as again, you need to run higher tyre pressures, just like in the real world Formula 1. Go for 21.8 at the front for a bit of front tyre longevity, and leave your rear tyre pressures at about 21.5. I've gone with an aero setup at 7 at the front and 10 at the rear. As mentioned in my last video, the aero setups across all tracks will be higher this year round, due to the track dependent aero tweaks that Codemasters have made. This aero balance should give you enough bite at the front of the car to get the car turned into the slower corners and enough rear downforce to allow you to keep the throttle pinned through the fast turns. For the transmission, you can run your on-throttle diff at 72% without incurring too much wheel spin out of the slower corners. Keeping it balanced like this will give you a better drive out of every corner. Then, I've lowered the off-throttle diff for better rear balance and to help get the nose of the car rotated into the slower corners of that awful chicane at the end of the lap. Next up, suspension geometry. This follows the trend which you'll see at a lot of tracks this year of higher front camber and lower rear camber with low to minimal toe. This style of setup, while not too extreme, will push the limits of the suspension geometry without negatively affecting tyre life too much. And the minimal levels of toe will help reduce drag down the long back straight at Spain. I've set up the suspension at 2 and 5 and the anti-roll bars ever so slightly stiffer at 3 and 6. This will give you a soft car so you can ride over the curbs without causing the car to react too badly, while the stiffer anti-roll bars and rear suspension will help with overall and rear stability throughout the lap. Then go for 3 and 6 on the ride height, which is a little higher than last year. This is due to Codemasters changing how low and extreme you can run your car this year round. For the brakes, run your pressure at 95%. This is high enough for almost maximum braking performance without running the risk of locking your front tyres. Then set up your brake bias to 56% for good overall braking stability. When it comes to tyre pressures, this year you can run much higher overall pressures. Real world setups run their tyre pressures as high as they can get away with for maximum performance, and F1 2021 does a much better job of replicating this compared to last year's game. So set your front tyre pressures to 22.2 and your rear pressures to 22.7. Let's jump into the setup, which has been designed to give you the most drivable car possible while still remaining fast enough to qualify towards the front end of the grid. Starting with the aero, set both front and rear wing to 11 for maximum downforce. If you are feeling confident or you'd like a little more top speed, lower your front end by 1. Then go for an extremely low transmission setup. Go for 55 on both on throttle and off throttle diff. This is designed to give you the most drivable car out of the slow corners without too much risk of lighting up the rear tyres. And the low off throttle diff will help you rotate your car into the slower turns. Then, for the suspension geometry, go with the usual style of setup of -2.7 for the front camber, -1.5 for the rear, then 0.08 and 0.29 for the toe setup. This follows the trend of most tracks, but remains a little more balanced as there aren't as many fast sweeping corners as other tracks. Next up, the suspension. You will want to run your car soft around Monaco, so you don't get too many unstable moments over the harsh bumps. Opt for 2 and 3 on your suspension setup, then reverse this and go for 5 and 2 on the anti-roll bars. This style of inverted anti-roll bar setup will help make your car more stable and predictable. Then set your ride height to 3 and 6 to ensure you have clearance over all of the bumps. Moving on to the brake setup, set your pressure to 97% for good braking performance and 56% on the brake bias. This will give you a very well-rounded brake setup with confidence that you won't lock up a wheel. Finally, set your tyre pressures to 21.8 at the front and 21.9 at the rears. Again, this follows the trend of other tracks, giving you the best compromise between tyre performance and tyre durability. I've gone with a lower front wing and a higher rear wing for strong rear stability throughout the fast corners. You don't need as much front downforce at Baku, as this will cause excess drag down the straights and you can compensate for the lack of front downforce in other areas of the setup. Go for 5 at the front and 7 at the rear. Then for transmission, Baku is a track where medium speed corners are king, meaning other than a few corners, there aren't too many heavy traction zones. This allows us to push the on-throttle diff up to 82. Then lower your off-throttle diff to 57 to give your car a little more rotation into the slower castle section. For our suspension geometry, we use a similar setup that we did at Monaco. It will give you a good amount of balance by utilising higher amounts of front camber and lower rear camber and toe. Go for -2.7 and -1.4 in the camber setup and 0.07 and 0.23 on the toe. Then moving on to the suspension, we're utilising a soft front suspension to allow the car to ride the curbs with less stability loss. Then we've gone for a stiffer rear suspension to give the car rigidity through the faster corners. Go for 2 and 5 on suspension, 7 and 6 on the anti-roll bars, and then 3 and 6 on the ride height. As for the brakes, go for 97% pressure, which is very common in a lot of my F1 2021 videos, and 57% on the brake bias. There are a few heavier braking zones which require a good brake balance, so moving the brake bias slightly forwards 57% will help reduce the overall stopping distance. So for the tyres, we've opted for lower pressures and softer tyres at the front with 21.8 and higher pressure rear tyres at 22.3. This will give you the best performance combined with tyre life across a race weekend. To ensure we have good downforce at the rear of the car, I've increased the rear wing setup to 9 and kept the front wing at 6. You don't need too much front downforce at Canada, as there aren't too many spots where you'll find yourself understeering. Plus, too much front wing will increase our drag and slow us down along the straights. Then for the transmission, an on-throttle diff of 78 is a good balance between ensuring we have enough drive through the faster corners while not being too high that we encounter too much wheel spin out of the slower corners, such as the turn 10 hairpin and the slow turn 2. I've kept the off-throttle diff at 60, just to ensure we get a little more rotation into these slower corners. This helps recoup some slow speed rotation that may be lost with the lower front wing aero setup. My suspension geometry setup is very similar to the setup I use at Austria, as both of these circuits have very similar characteristics. Go for -2.8 and -1.2 on the camber, and our usual toe setup of 0.07 and 0.2. For the suspension, I've gone extremely soft, as you'll be all over the curbs throughout a lap of Canada. If you stiffen your car too much, you'll have an extremely hard time with stability loss, so go for 2 and 3 on the suspension setup. Then I've gone for an inverse anti-roll bar setup with stiffer front ARBs at 7 while keeping the rear at 6. Many setups in F1 2021 opt for soft front anti-roll bars with stiffer rears. While this approach does help the car rotate a little more, it will also make it much twitchier on corner exit. So to ensure we have good stability throughout a race, I've gone for a slightly stiffer front anti-roll bar setup. Then set the ride height at 2 and 6, which is just about the sweet spot for ride heights around Canada. For the brakes, opt for our usual approach of just lower than 100% brake pressure at 98% and a brake bias of 56%. This is just about the perfect brake setup in F1 2021 and is universal across many tracks. Then for the tyres, I've lowered the pressures at the front to 22.2 for a little extra softness at the front of the car and for slightly better tyre life, and I've kept the rears high at 22.7 for outright performance. Kicking off with the aerodynamic setup, you should run a lower front wing compared to your rear wing to ensure you have good rear end stability. You don't need a huge amount of front end downforce, and a front wing of 7 should do the trick. Combine this with a rear wing of 9 to give you a good starting point for the rest of your setup. Moving on to the transmission, because of the predominantly fast corners around Paul Ricard, you should run your on-throttle diff setup reasonably high at 80. This will ensure the wheels keep rotating, driving you through the fast sweeping turns. Then run a low off-throttle diff to make up for a little of the front end downforce that is lost due to our lower front wing. Go for 57 here, which will allow your car to rotate well into the slower corners. As with many of our F1 2021 car setups, our French setup follows a similar pattern of high front camber and low amounts of toe. This just seems to be the best way to set up your suspension geometry this year, giving good rotation, stability and tyre life. Go for -2.6 and -1.6 on the front and rear camber, then go for 0.08 and 0.2 on the toe for the best top speed potential and minimal drag. For the suspension, F1 2021 is a killer when it comes to curbs. So as with many of our setups so far, we've gone for a soft suspension setup. Go for 2 at the front and 5 at the rear for the suspension. Then reverse this and go for 5 on the front anti-roll bars and 2 on the rear. This will help lessen any snap oversteer you get on acceleration. This suspension and anti-roll bar setup will help keep your car balanced throughout the lap. Finally, a ride height of 2 and 6 will set you up nicely to handle any bumps and elevation change. For the brakes, you should look for a high brake pressure of 98% and a brake bias of 56%. This is very much the norm across most of my car setups in F1 2021, with the brake pressure sitting just below 100%, helping you stop quickly but minimising the risk of locking up a wheel. And the brake bias should always be around 56 to 57% at all tracks. Any lower than this, and your car will have a tendency to rotate on you under braking. With the tyres, go for 23 on both fronts and 22.7 on both rears. This will help lower the amount of front tyre wear you will see throughout the race, while being stiff enough to keep your car responsive and agile throughout the faster sequences. The Red Bull Ring is a track which requires more rear downforce than it does front. You need to ensure your car doesn't lose rear downforce mid or late corner, otherwise you'll have a car with a tendency to be twitchy and oversteer happy. Go for a higher rear aero setup of 8 with just 7 at the front. This will be enough front end to allow you to not understeer into corners while ensuring you have enough rear downforce. Our transmission setup is relatively balanced with an on-throttle diff of 72. This will ensure your car's rear wheels push you through the fast corners while being low enough to allow a more gradual loss of traction out of the slower corners. This will give you a car which has good mid-corner speed potential but is more drivable throughout a full race distance. Then go with a low off-throttle diff at just 57. The lower value here will give you a car with a little more rotation into the extremely slow turn 3. I've gone with a reasonably balanced setup on the camber for Austria. You can push your car and tyres throughout a race here, so tyre life isn't as important here as it is elsewhere. Set your camber to -2.8 and -1.3 to give you a good balance between performance and tyre preservation. Then a front toe value of 0.07 and a rear toe value of 0.2 will ensure you have minimal drag down the long straights. As I mentioned earlier, ensuring your car is able to handle the bumps around the Red Bull Ring is crucial to a fast lap time. So that's why I've gone for an extremely soft suspension setup. Go for 2 at the front and 5 at the rear to allow you to ride the curbs without much stability loss. Then go for an anti-roll bar setup of 3 at the front and 8 at the rear. You won't encounter too much rear end traction loss, meaning you don't need a setup which accounts for this too much. Instead, a soft front anti-roll bar and stiffer rear will give you more rotation and performance without the worry of a lack of stability. Then, for the ride height, go for 3 at the front and 7 at the rear. For the brake setup, opt for my usual approach of around 98% brake pressure and a brake bias of 56%. Finally, for the tyre pressures, go for 24.2 at the front and 23.1 at the rears. These are relatively high pressures, but as mentioned, Austria isn't a tyre killer, so there shouldn't be too much concern for tyre preservation here, although I have lowered the tyre pressure slightly away from maximum to give you a little longevity in the race. We've gone for 7 at the front of the car and 8 at the rear. This combination gives you a balanced aero setup while ensuring the rear of your car is planted enough to the track for a good amount of rear stability. I wouldn't recommend running much more aero than this, otherwise you will start to lose out along the long straights on top end speed. And if you don't have top end speed, you'll find it incredibly tough during a race to overtake or defend. Moving on to the transmission, you should run a similar setup to our Canada and Austria setups. Go for an on diff of 78 and an off diff of 55. The higher on throttle diff really helps your car accelerate through and out of the faster corners, and the low off throttle helps keep your car stable and gives extra rotation at slower speeds, which can be very helpful at the beginning and end of the lap of Silverstone. For the suspension geometry, I've gone for a front camber setup of -2.8, which isn't as aggressive as some setups, then go for a -1.7 for your rear. For the toe, you'll want to prioritise your top speed by minimising any drag, so go for a low toe setup of 0.06 at the front and 0.2 at the rear. Just like other high-speed tracks, you will want a softer car setup for Silverstone, so by setting your front suspension to 2 and rear suspension to 5, you'll achieve a car which has the ability to ride the curbs without too much stability loss. Plus, the stiffer rear end will help with responsiveness through the quick direction changes. Then I've opted for a high front anti-roll bar setup at 8 with a lower rear anti-roll bar setup of 4. I've run inverted anti-roll bar setups like this around a lot of tracks in F1 2021 as it helps keep your car stable under acceleration at high speeds. It will slightly reduce your front end turning ability a little, but sacrificing this to ensure you have excellent rear stability is certainly worth it. Finally, a ride height of 3 and 7 is pretty much the norm for Silverstone in F1 2021. For the brakes, run our usual setup of 98% brake pressure and 56% brake bias. This will do you well at most tracks and Silverstone isn't any different. Finally, I'm running higher tyre pressures at Silverstone. Fortunately, for F1 2021 you can run aggressive tyre pressures without the risk of tyre failures that have plagued real world races at Silverstone across the past few years. So go for 23.8 for both fronts and 23.1 for both rears. I've gone for almost maximum downforce of 10 and 11 for the wings. I've prioritised rear downforce over front just to ensure that throughout the medium speed corners you're able to apply the throttle as early as possible. By dropping our front downforce from 11 to 10, it frees up a little boost to top end speed, opening the door for overtaking and defending during a race. And you really won't lose too much downforce just by running 10 on the front wing, as we can recoup this elsewhere in our setup. For the diff setup, I've gone for a reasonably balanced on-throttle diff of 72. This will help push your car through the longer corners such as turns 2, 5 and 14. If you do find yourself struggling for rear traction a little out of the slower corners, you can lower this a touch. Then go for an off diff of 62, which is close to where it is for most tracks. This lower value will allow the car to rotate more at lower speed, compensating for some of the front downforce loss from my aero setup. I've set up the suspension geometry with our camber further right than at some tracks. Go for -2.7 and -1.3 for your camber, and then go for just higher than minimum toe at 0.07 and 0.23. This style of setup will allow for good tyre life during a race while keeping your car stable. Like many tracks, Hungary is a circuit which requires a soft suspension setup. The curbs here are especially brutal and will unsettle your car so much. Just try accelerating out of the slow chicane with your right tyres over the curve and see what I mean. To account for this, go for a soft suspension setup of 2 and 5. I would ideally like to run even lower than this to make your car even softer and the curbs more manageable, However, doing so would hamper your car's ability to get into corners. This suspension setup is soft enough to allow you to ride over some curbs around this track, but others you will have to be a little careful on. Then go for a stiffer front anti-roll bar setup and softer rear with 7 and 5. This style of anti-roll bar setup will give you a stable car under acceleration. Finally, run a ride height of 3 and 7, which is just high enough to allow you to ride curbs without bottoming out. Then go for 97% brake pressure and 56% brake bias. This will give you good brake response while lowering your chances of locking a wheel, and the 56% brake bias will give you a stable car under braking. And for the tyres, I've set up my car with 23.8 for both fronts and 22.7 for both rears. This fairly high pressure tyre setup will give you the best balance between performance and tyre longevity. I've gone for 6 at the front, which gives a solid turn-in, and then I've lowered the rear aero to just 4. You would think that the low rear aero would result in a car with a rather loose rear end. However, combined with the high-speed nature of Spa and the rest of this car setup, you certainly won't lack rear end grip. For the transmission, I've left the on-diff at 75. This allows your car to drive you out of the higher speed corners. The only corners you may like to lower your on-throttle diff a little are the first corner and the final chicane, although both of these are manageable with some good throttle control. Then, for the off-throttle diff, I've lowered it down to 58, which feels just about right for Spa. The suspension geometry around Spa follows the normal approach, of relatively close to maximum front camber, and then almost minimum values for all of the other suspension geometry setup options. Go for -2.6 on your front camber, -1.9 on the rear, and then 0.06 and 0.2 for the toe. When it comes to the suspension, to allow your car to be as drivable as possible, I've gone for a very soft suspension all round. This will allow you to push your car through corners and over all of the curbs. It also helps with stability through the fast final sector and will allow you to stay almost flat through Eau Rouge. Go for 2 and 3 on your suspension and the same for your anti-roll bars. Then round out the suspension setup with a ride height of 2 and 6. In terms of the brakes, there aren't too many overly heavy braking zones around Spa despite the high speed nature. So go with a balanced brake setup of 97% brake pressure with a brake bias setup of 57%. A slightly more frontward brake bias will help minimise braking distances, especially into the final chicane and turn 5 at the end of the long straight. For the tyres, I've kept the front relatively balanced at 23.4, then I've increased the pressure on the rear tyres up to 23.1, which will give a good trade-off between true performance and race longevity. It's surprising that for a track so fast you need such a high amount of downforce. I've set up my car with 10-10 wings. This approach will give you extremely good grip through the windy corners at Zandvoort, and you'll be especially competitive through the middle section of the lap. I have seen some car setups opt for 11-11 wings, however you will really feel the downside of this down the long pit straight and all the way through the first sector. You'll lose a little top end speed, and in my experience lowering this a touch to 10-10 will produce an overall better lap time. As most corners are medium speed sweeping turns, I've gone for high on throttle diff of 82. This will push your car through the corners, allowing you to maintain a high minimum speed and will give you great acceleration out of each turn. Then go for a relatively high off throttle diff of 66. I say high as many setups for other tracks use an off throttle diff lower than 60. You don't need as much low speed rotation around Zandvoort, so higher off throttle diff is okay. For the suspension geometry, I've actually opted for a relatively low camber setup. I've gone for -2.8 on the front and -1.3 on the rear camber. Then, just like many other setup videos, I've lowered both toe values. The front is set at 0.07 and the rear is set right at its minimum of 0.2. This setup gives good stability while looking after the tyres throughout a race distance. Your tyres will be lent on a lot throughout the fast sweeping corners, so looking after them throughout a race is very important. Like many tracks, I've gone for a soft front suspension. You will be hitting a lot of high curbs at Zandvoort, so having a car which can handle these is important. Go for 2 at the front and slightly higher at the rear of 5. For the anti-roll bars, I've heavily prioritised stability at medium to high speed. I've set up the front anti-roll bar at 7 and the rear to 2. This will give you a car which is incredibly stable under acceleration, which is crucial for the high speed corners such as turns 7 and 14. If you run too stiff at the rear, you will find yourself losing stability through these high speed corners. Then go for a ride height of 2 and 6, which is pretty aggressive and low, although it's just about as low as you could possibly run around Zandvoort. For the brakes, I've kept the same brake pressure from our Spa setup video of 97%, which produces good stopping power. Then I've lowered the brake bias a touch towards being more balanced at 56%. Overall, this will give you a solid braking platform without too much risk of locking either front or rears. And for the tyres, I've gone away from running maximum pressures like many setups do around Zandvoort. Instead, lower tyre pressures will go towards helping preserve your tyre wear throughout a full race distance. Go for 23.8 on both fronts and 22.7 on both rears. I have gone for a low downforce setup with a front wing of 4 and a rear wing of 5. This is higher than some tracks, and that's mainly due to that middle sector. Both Lesmos and Ascari require a car with the ability to remain stable at speed while flinging your car left and right. If you set up your aero too low, you'll really struggle to get the front end turned into these corners, which in turn will compromise your run onto the long straights which follow. For the transmission setup, I've gone for a surprisingly low on-throttle diff of just 62. The main purpose of this is to help the low speed traction out of the first 2 sets of chicanes. Both of these chicanes are taken at low speed, and the first chicane in particular is followed by the Curva Grande, which is full throttle and a great overtaking spot. If you don't get a good exit out of the first chicane, you'll be vulnerable into the second. So a low on diff will help with a gradual loss of traction, giving you a solid opportunity to accelerate harder earlier. Then for the off diff, I've gone with a setup of 55, which will help rotate your car at low speed into the slower corners. The suspension geometry setup is a familiar story. Close to maximum front camber, and then low rear camber and low toe setup is the way to go at Monza. The low toe will minimise drag, increasing your top speed potential, and the camber is designed to give a combination of performance and tyre life during a race, without focusing on either of these too heavily and penalising the other. Go for -2.7 front camber, -1.9 rear, and 0.06 and 0.2 on the toe. The suspension setup I've gone with is extremely soft. Well, it is at the front of the car anyway, with a slightly stiffer rear end. The soft front suspension and anti-roll bars will help your car tackle the high curbs throughout a lap of Monza without too much drama. As with most tracks in F1 2021, the curbs around Monza are brutal and will throw your car about. However, a fast lap requires you to ride over these curbs at most corners, so having a soft suspension will help with this. Go with a front suspension setup of 1 and rear of 4. Then set up your anti-roll bars with 1 at the front and 6 at the rear. The stiffer rear suspension and anti-roll bar setup will help keep your car responsive on corner entry, and it will help it rotate at slower speeds. If these were much lower, your car would feel too sluggish, which is not ideal when throwing your car into a Ascari at high speed. Then go for a ride height of 2 and 6 for the best performance. I've gone with a slightly higher brake pressure than normal at 98%. I always tend to steer away from 100% brake pressure, just to allow for a little give when it comes to potential lockups. Then set up your brake bias at 57% for even better straight line stopping performance. The tyre pressures have been left fairly neutral and balanced. This is because the faster corners such as Parabolica can take a toll on tyre wear during a race. Leaving your front tyres at just 23 will help with overall tyre wear. Then I've bumped up the rear tyre pressures just slightly to 22.3 for a little extra performance without much tyre wear loss. You do need a rather high amount of front downforce around Russia. You'll want a car which turns into corners well, otherwise you'll find yourself compromising on mid-corner apex speed, which will lose you a whole bunch of lap time. The key to a fast lap time at Sochi is maintaining a high minimum speed through each corner. So by setting our front wing to 9 and rear wing to 7, this will give us a car which lives on its nose. It will turn in exactly where you point it, meaning you can hit the perfect racing line through each corner. And as long as you get your car turned into most corners, you shouldn't worry too much about the rear of your car stepping away or oversteering. So running a lower rear wing saves a little drag and shouldn't compromise your speed. I've kept the on-throttle diff setup reasonably balanced at 77. Not only is this Valtteri Bottas' race number, a driver who genuinely performs very well at Russia, which must be a good omen, right? It will also help push your car through the corners, again prioritising a high minimum apex speed. I haven't gone much higher on the on-diff, as there are a few corners, especially in the final sector, which are a little trickier to find traction. Then go for an off-diff of just 57 to once again prioritise the front end of your car and boost rotation. Our suspension geometry is almost identical to the one I ran at Monza, just with a slight increase to front camber. This setup is generally a great approach for most tracks, especially the high speed ones like Sochi. So go with -2.6 front and -1.9 rear camber, and 0.06 and 0.2 on the toe. Again, like Monza, I've gone for a very soft suspension setup. I've gone for a suspension of 2 and 2 with anti-roll bars of 2 and 3. You will be hitting most curbs around Sochi if you're looking for the fastest lap time, so ensuring the car is soft enough to handle every curb is priority. Unlike Monza, I've also run a soft rear end to increase stability. There aren't anywhere near as many slow corners at Sochi, meaning we don't need the extra rotation from our suspension and anti-roll bar setup, allowing us to focus on stability over curbs instead. Finally, run a ride height of 3 and 6, which is a little higher than some tracks, just to account for those curves. For the brakes, I've set them up with 97% brake pressure, which is just about right. You won't be locking any wheels with this amount of pressure, but you will get great stopping power. Then go for 57% on the brake bias. As you'll be braking in a straight line for most corners, you can run a more front focused brake bias for extra braking performance without the worry about stability loss. I've increased all tyre pressures for this car setup, so go with 23.8 for both fronts and 22.7 for both rears. You won't need to worry about tyre wear too much with this setup, but you will reap the performance rewards from the slightly higher tyre pressures. Starting with the aero, I've gone with a front wing aero of 10 and rear wing of 11. Now a lot of setups do run 11 wings, but I found by lowering the front wing a little bit, we didn't sacrifice too much on rotation or turning, and it did give us a little less drag, which helped us compete a little bit more during the race for overtakes and defending if needed. Then for the transmission, I've gone for an on-diff of 74, really balanced setup, but it will help you accelerate out of the slower corners with a nice gradual loss of traction, while allowing you to keep speed through the faster mid-speed corners. Then go with an off-diff of 58%. This will help a little bit with rotation, which will make up for the slightly lower front downforce that we're running. Then for the suspension geometry, we've gone with a high-ish front camber of -2.8, then a very low rear camber of -1.9. The high front camber will give us good grip through the corners while the car leans onto the wheel, and the low rear camber will help with traction slightly out of each turn. Then go with a front toe of 0.07 and a rear toe of 0.2. This is purely to try to eliminate any drag that we have, while ensuring the front of the car remains responsive. Then for the suspension setup, I've gone with an extremely soft front suspension and soft front anti-roll bar, because you're going to be riding over all sorts of curbs around Singapore, especially if you want a fast lap time. So keep this right at its minimum of 1. And then for the rear, I've gone for 5 on both the rear suspension and rear anti-roll bar. This will give you good speed and stability through and out of the predominantly 90-degree corners. You'll want to maintain a relatively high minimum speed around most of Singapore, so you shouldn't worry too much about stability loss. This soft front and reasonably firm rear setup will give you good enough balance without worrying too much about losing the rear end. Then for the ride height, I've gone slightly higher than some of our car setups at 3 and 8. This is purely because the curves at Singapore are killers and you will be over them a lot. So for stability and balancing, we've had to raise the ride height both at the front and rear ever so slightly. Then for the brakes, go for 97% on the brake pressure for good stopping power and 57% on the brake bias. This is ever so slightly more frontward on the brake bias than we normally would run, just by a touch, but this will help slow you down and minimise those braking distances, while ensuring you don't get any rear locking at all through some of the trickier left-right sequences. Then for the tyre pressures, go with relatively balanced front tyre pressures of 23.4 on both, and then higher rear tyre pressures at 22.7. You would be faster at running ever so slightly higher tyre pressures around Singapore, but you'll sacrifice tyre life through a race, so we've knocked them back a little bit to be a little bit more balanced. I've gone for an aero setup of 7 at the front and 9 at the rear. Just as I mentioned, this is designed to give us good rear stability. You won't be so front downforce reliant around Suzuka, so we can reduce our front wing aero a little bit, which will help with drag, and it will help us prioritise our rear wing. On the transmission, because Suzuka is a very flowing circuit with medium to high speed corners, we can run slightly higher on diff at 80%. This will allow the car to carry speed through the corner, helping increase our minimum speed. Then go with an off diff of 58%, which will just help with rotation into the slower corners. For the suspension geometry, I've run a close to maximum front camber of -2.6, which will help a lot as we'll always be leaning on our tyres. Then go with a lower rear camber of -1.8, higher front toe of 0.09 and low rear toe of 0.2. Running slightly higher front toe than we normally would for a car setup will just help a little bit with responsiveness as you're flicking the car left and right. For the suspension, as per usual, I've gone with a very soft suspension setup. I've gone for 1 at the front and 3 at the rear. This will help primarily with the middle sector where you'll be jumping over curbs left and right, and it will help keep the car balanced and stable. Then go with a medium to balanced front anti-roll bar of 5 and again a soft rear anti-roll bar of 2. Running stiffer front anti-roll bars and softer rears again just helps with stability and balance and helps keep the car from being too twitchy. Then go with a ride height of 3 and 7, which is just about right for Suzuka. Moving on to the brakes, go with 97% brake pressure for good stopping power and 56% brake bias. You can run slightly more rearward brake bias around Suzuka, as there aren't too many heavy braking zones, you'll always just be dabbing the brake pedal, so keeping your brake bias fairly balanced is a good way to go. Then for the tyre pressures, I've run reasonably high tyre pressures across the board here, with 24.2 on both fronts and 22.7 on both rears. This is designed to give us a close to maximum amount of responsiveness as we're flicking the car left and right, although I have kept them away from maximum just to give us a little bit of a boost on tyre life during the race. Starting with the aero, I've done something a little bit different compared to most of our F1 2021 setups. I've gone with a higher front wing aero of 8 and a lower rear wing aero of 7. This is primarily because you need a good front end for that last sector, otherwise you're going to understeer horribly. Essentially, if you can point your car in the right direction and get the front turned in, the rear will follow and not cause too much trouble. This allows us to run slightly less rear wing aero without too much worry about oversteer moments or loose rear ends. During my testing, I did run slightly higher wings of 9 and 8, which allowed for slightly better turning and more stability, but did hamper us down the long straights, meaning it would be tricky to overtake during a race. For the transmission setup, I've gone with a reasonably balanced on-throttle diff. A lot of time trial setups run the on-throttle diff very high, but I found lowering it down to around 77 helps with acceleration out of the slower corners, without too much loss of traction. We can't run it too low though, otherwise we will hamper our acceleration through and out of the faster corners. And then go with the usual low off-throttle diff around 57% to help rotate the car into the slower corners. And then the suspension geometry follows a similar setup style to most of our other setups, with high front camber, medium to low rear camber, and then low to minimal toe. So go with -2.6, -1.6 on the camber, and then 0.07 and 0.2 on the toe. This is designed for both stability, responsiveness, and help prolong the tyre life during a race. For the suspension, I've gone with a soft suspension setup, again pretty usual for most of our F1 2021 setups. This will help the car ride over the curbs, especially through the first sector, where you've got the really fast Maggots, Beckett's, Chapel style complex, as you'll be driving right over those curbs. So go with 1 and 3 on the suspension setup. And then for the anti-roll bars, again I've gone with a stiffer front anti-roll bar and a softer rear at 6 and 2. This is completely different to all of the time trial setups that you'll find at the top of the leaderboard. However, having a stiffer front anti-roll bar will really help with stability through the race, which is crucial for putting in solid, consistent lap times. And then go the ride height of 3 and 7, which again is set up for stability. For the brakes, go with our usual 97% brake pressure and then 57% on the brake bias, which gives it a nice balanced setup. I've gone with tyre pressures of 22.6 on both fronts and 23.1 on both rears. The lower front tyre pressures will help soften the car over the bumps, and the higher rear tyre pressures will help with stability. I've prioritised the front, as I mentioned, just so we can get the car turned in nicely to those 90-degree corners. You really don't want to have a car that understeers around Mexico, otherwise you're just going to compromise your exit speed, which will in turn make you vulnerable during a race down the straight. So go with 9 on the front wing and 7 on the rear. I have seen some time trial setups run this differently, so some time trial setups run at a lower front wing and rear wing, which probably gives you better overall lap time. But as I said, you'll be slower down the straights and faster through the corners, which, unless you're at the front of a race, isn't overly useful. For me, and for best stability and consistency, I've gone with a higher front wing and lower rear. Then moving on to the transmission, I've kept the on-diff exactly where it started at 75%. Mexico's a tricky track to set up your diff for, because the middle part of the lap requires a high on-diff ultimately, where some of the slower, more technical turns, especially the last corner sequence in the stadium area, require a low on-diff. So keeping it balanced is pretty much the way to go. I do like prioritising a lower on-diff, just so you've got better control of your traction loss under acceleration. Then go with the off-diff of 58%, which is pretty much kind of our normal around most tracks at F1 2021. It gives good stability and good turning rotation at lower speeds. Then moving on to the suspension geometry, I've gone with close to full right front camber and rear camber. This will help keep the car balanced and stable through that faster sequence in the middle of the track. It'll also help you lean on your car a little bit more through the medium speed 90-degree corners of the first sector. So go with -2.6 at the front and -1.2 on the rear camber. Then for the front toe, I've gone with 0.08, then I've kept the rear toe at 0.2 to minimise drag. It's no surprise that I've gone with a soft front suspension of just 1. As I said, Mexico is essentially an exercise in riding over curbs, so you'll want your front end soft enough to be able to do this without any stability loss. Then for the rear, I've kept it a little bit stiffer of 4. For the front anti-roll bar, I've gone with 5, and the rear, I've gone with 2. Just like on some of my other setups, this will help with stability, especially at medium to high speed. Then go with a front ride height of 3 and rear ride height of 7. For your brakes, run 97% brake pressure and 56% brake bias. This will give you a good, well-rounded setup, and you could always push your front brake bias up to 57, especially for that first corner, but 56% overall throughout the lap is a good balanced way to go. Then for your tyres, I've gone almost maximum pressures on all tyres. The only reason I haven't gone maximum is to help maintain tyre life a little bit. So go with 24.2 on both fronts and 22.7 on both rears. I've gone with a front wing of 9 and a rear wing of 8. By having a slightly higher front wing, it just helps the car turn into the corners and lets us hit those apexes a little bit easier. The relatively high rear wing also gives us good stability under acceleration, which is crucial when accelerating out of the longer sweeping corners. For the transmission, I've gone with both an on-diff and off-diff of 55. A lot of the corners around Interlagos are relatively slow speed, especially throughout the middle sector. You want to be able to accelerate early without any real snap oversteer. The last thing you want is a car which loses traction easily around Interlagos. So that's why the on-diff is super low at 55. This will give you a gradual loss of traction under acceleration and will allow you to get on the throttle earlier. The off-diff, just like with many of our setups, allows the car to rotate a little bit easier. For the suspension geometry, it's no surprise that I've gone with almost maximum front camber and then almost minimum rear camber and minimum toe on both front and rear. Then for the suspension, I've gone with a soft front suspension of 1 and relatively soft rear suspension of 3. This combined with a stiffer front anti-roll bar of 4 and soft rear anti-roll bar of 1 will really help your car stay balanced throughout a whole lap. Then go with a relatively low front ride height of 2 and a rear ride height of 6. For the brakes, go with a brake pressure of 97% and a brake bias of 56%. And then for the tyres, go with a balanced front tyre pressure setup of 23 on both fronts and then a high rear tyre pressure setup of 22.7. The higher rear pressures will give you good stability under acceleration, and the lower fronts will help with tyre wear throughout a race. You'll be leaning on your tyres a lot around Interlagos as many of the corners are quite long and prolonged, meaning your front tyres can take a bit of punishment. So this lower pressures at the front should help with that. I've gone for a generally high aero setup here. Some people like their aero lower at Australia and some people even prefer a rear focus setup, but I've gone higher on the front wing at 10 and lower on the rear at 8. This will give you a pointy car which is willing to turn into corners and hit apex as well, which is great because then you can focus on the corner exit instead, which is crucial around Australia because there are a few medium to long straights with a few different overtaking opportunities. By having a front wing aero which is higher, it means you can throw your car into the corners and it will generally respond and go the direction you point it. Moving on to the transmission, The on-throttle diff is just a battle of how high you can get away with. In an ideal world, we'd run a really high on-throttle diff of 80 plus, even 90 potentially, but there are a few corners that prevent us from doing that. Both the middle and last sector have corners which are a little bit slower, which means we need to focus a little bit on our traction out of corners, which is why I've gone for a 78%, relatively balanced. Then the off-throttle diff, go with 58% for some good rotation and stability. With the suspension geometry, I've gone closer to max on front and rear camber than some tracks, go with -2.6 and -1.3. This will give you a car which you can really lean on, and when you're taking the corners at medium to high speed like you will be at Australia, this is pretty crucial. Then for the toe, go with 0.07 at the front and 0.2 at the rear. This will help a little by limiting drag, which in turn will potentially increase your top speed. Then for the suspension, I've gone extremely soft on the front, which will help us over those curbs a little bit. As I said at the beginning, the curbs are pretty violent here, so you want a car which can really handle them well. So go 1 and 5 on your suspension setup, and then with a focus on stability and overall balance, I've gone with 6 and 2 on your anti-roll bars. Finally, go with 3 and 7 on the ride height, which is designed to allow us enough clearance to really attack the curbs. For the brake setup, I've got 97% brake pressure and 56% brake bias. Again, this is pretty standard across most of my setups, as I do generally like my car to brake pretty consistently from track to track. And then for the tyres, I've gone a little bit lower pressures on the front than I do the rears, but all tyres are pretty close to max. Go 24.2 on the fronts and 23.1 on the rears. I've set up the tyres in this way to give you almost the best responsiveness you can get out of your car, although I've had to come away from max a little bit just to aid tyre wear during a race. Starting with the aero, I've gone for a front wing of 7 and a rear wing of 8. You need a relatively balanced aero setup for Abu Dhabi. You need a car which won't let go of the rear when you accelerate, but also has enough front end to get you turned into these 90-degree corners. In terms of the transmission, I've gone relatively low at 65% on diff and 55% off diff. There are quite a few slower corners and heavy acceleration zones where you can lose traction pretty quickly, so having the lower on-throttle diff will help with a slightly gradual loss of traction, allowing you to manage your acceleration a little better. For the suspension geometry, I've gone -2.7 on the front camber and -2 on the rear. This will give you a car which is pretty responsive, but balanced at the same time. Then go with a front toe of 0.06 and a rear toe of 0.2. This part of the setup is designed to just minimise drag almost as much as we can, so you have maximum top speed potential along the straights. For the suspension, I've gone pretty soft. The curbs around Abu Dhabi are killers, they're absolutely horrible. So I've gone 1 on the front suspension, 4 on the rear, and then I've gone for front anti-roll bar of 2 and rear anti-roll bar of 6. This will give you a car which can handle the curbs a little bit better, although they will still throw you all over the place, so be prepared for that. Round out our suspension setup with a ride height of 3 and 7. And then looking at the brake setup, I've gone for 99% brake pressure, which is the highest I've run all season long. This is purely just to minimise our stopping distance at the end of those really long straights. Go with a brake bias at 57%. Again, this should help shorten your braking distance overall, while remaining balanced through some of the shorter, sharper braking zones. Then for the tyres, go for 24.2 on the front pressures and 23.1 on the rear pressures. This will give you a responsive car while maintaining a little tyre life throughout races. So let's jump straight in and have a look at our Chinese F1 2021 setup. Starting with the aero, I've gone for a front wing aero of 9 and a rear wing aero of 8. This is slightly different to some setup approaches for China, as some prioritise the rear wing over front. However, I feel that you need a little more front end to get your car turned in, especially in some of the slower cars or the My Team career car. Going with 9 at the front and 8 at the rear is actually quite a high downforce setup for China, and you will feel a little bit of this pain down some of the straights. I did play around with having 7 on the rear wing, which helped at the end of the long straights, but the car was just a little more twitchy through the corners, and I felt that the best approach for an actual race setup is to increase that rear wing a touch up to 8, as it just gave better stability across a lap, and slightly better lap time as well. You'll see at the end of this video when I'm racing against the other cars that towards the end of the long straight, the other cars do come back at me a little bit, but I have more than enough top speed to pull some overtakes. So moving on to the transmission, I've gone for an on diff of just 65 and an off diff of 55. China has a combination of medium to high speed corners and a few slower speed corners where traction is crucial. So I've prioritised the slower speed corners by lowering my on throttle diff a little. Again, I find that during a race, a slightly lower on throttle diff will just help with overall consistency when you're trying to get traction out of the corners. Then looking at the suspension geometry, I've gone with a very usual approach here of right on the front camber and then left on the rear camber and both toe values. So go with -2.7 on the front camber, -2 on the rear, 0.06 on the front toe and 0.2 on the rear. This will give you a setup with tyre life in mind a little, but also minimising drag and increasing top speed. Especially if we're running a rear wing of 8, we need to reduce our drag as much as possible to compensate for this. Then going for the suspension setup, I've gone with a soft front suspension of just 1 and a rear suspension of 4. Then for the anti-roll bars I've inverted this and I've gone for 4 on the front and 2 on the rear. This style of suspension setup will create a soft car and one which is super stable. By running a softer rear anti-roll bar, your car is much less likely to oversteer or give way under traction, which when you're accelerating out some of the longer corners and onto the straights is quite crucial. The last thing you want is to lose rear traction midway through one of these corners. Then go for a ride height of 3 and 7, which is pretty standard across most tracks. For the brakes, go with our standard brake setup of 97% pressure and 57% brake bias. Knocking back the brake pressure away from 100 will just minimise your chance of locking a wheel, and the front focus brake bias of 57% will help reduce stopping distances, which is vitally important, especially at the end of that long straight. And then for the tyres, I've reduced the front tyre pressures away from maximum with a value of 23.8. This will help your front tyres last during a race, where they can take a bit of a battering around the long corners. Then for the rears, go the pretty high setup of 23.1. And that'll do it for our Chinese F1 2021 car setup, and it will round out the F1 2021 car setup series, for now. As I mentioned at the start of this video, as soon as the new tracks drop, I'll jump straight on them and create setup videos for them as well, so check back as soon as those tracks are dropped. Also, going forward I'll be making videos with wet race setups in mind, as well as videos such as how to convert dry setups to wet setups. So why not hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to be notified as soon as any more F1 2021 setup videos drop. And as always, if you enjoy this setup and it helps you out, hit the like button, as that will really help as many people as possible see this setup video. But until next time, see you on track, guys.